Recently, I did a video that was a discussion and page through of Knock Number One, which is the old school gaming bric-a-brac zine, and I am back with a similar discussion and page through of Knock Number Two. I point you to the video discussion on Knock Number One, which pointed out what is continuing to be evident in the second edition of this adventure gaming bric-a-brac, which is that this compendium of materials from around the blogosphere is really unique in combining practical in-game use tables and event NPCs and enemies, key to old school essentials, but really adaptable into many OSR systems with macro level discussions of gaming, mostly or almost all centered on fantasy gaming, sort of generally speaking, not particularly sci-fi or horror. I think there's something about horror in here. We start out and as with Knock Number One, it's a compendium, and as you flip through the zine, which is a nice hefty 226 pages of just jam-packed of content, it changes between articles like this. This is a DM advice article. It opens up with the master's words of wisdom and very specific tables and things like random rival adventuring parties that you could roll on this D12 table and just get a paragraph description to throw into either something that would actually happen in your session or just some flavor text. We're going to go through and look at the amazing art and design of the zine, which, like its predecessor, is incredibly thoughtfully done. I'll show you here the credits, the contributors, and the table of contents of this piece. We're not going to have a chance to look at everything in here. The first piece on DM advice, there's a zillion pieces of DM advice that are given, and it starts out pretty generically in a sense, like giving meaningful choices and things like that. But the purpose of this piece, which I think is very relevant to soloists in particular, is to let your decisions matter. The author is saying you are the manager of this session. The message here is that the decisions that are happening in the game need to have impact and carry through, and suggestions about ways to have that actually be the case. The next piece by Chris McDowell is there's a lot of good GM advice there at the high end, but here are some things in an easy way to make sessions flow that aren't necessarily high-level advice, but for example, just let your characters do something that makes them feel good and happy. Put some humor into the game. Here's where there is a little suggestion of what to do with horror. This is really much more directed toward a traditional, or much more useful probably for a GM sitting around a table with players. For example, cut off in mid-sentence if you're running horror. That he says, the wardrobe is covered in cobwebs. You slowly crack it open and you feel the air get cold around you. You smell rotten wood and see, and then stop. So some nice advice there. We have the Knight Errant generator here. You can roll up some heraldry for your character and describe what that might look like. And then you can give a fighting style to him, his name, his quirks, and a quest that he might be on. This is an interesting way of this talking about character death and if you need to regenerate a character quickly. And what's cool here is it's kind of a press your luck scenario where you are rolling 2d6 and you can keep rolling it until you roll the same total twice. You can decide each time, and if you continue rolling it, you get to a certain level, but then if you end up rolling the same total twice, you go back to level 1. And then the article continues with giving you, based on your race and class, you then get to roll on a table that gives you some backstory benefit if you start out with level 1. And I like this concept. I may bring this in somehow. It gives a sense of a character with a history and not necessarily just starting over at level 1, but some risk involved in this. There's a piece by Ann Hunter on thinking about different types of information in RPGs, whether it is landmark information, that is to say, automatic and free, or hidden, meaning you have to learn it in some manner, and that there are costs to learning hidden information, whether it's risk or spending time. And then there's secret information, and secret information needs to be found out. And she goes on to talk about the difference between landmark and hidden and secret information, and narratively the difference between these different kinds of information. And I think this I found useful to think about for my own sessions in terms of, I think for the soloist in particular, we are generating information typically by rolling on some kind of table, and then it's either there or not. But to categorize it in some way, the kind of information it is, I think that could add some narrative richness. So that caused me to think a bit more about how I might do this in the future. Great piece of art here. These are different spellbook magical research results that you could get, and they are quirky. So for example, you develop a single dose of a potion, but you have no idea what it is, or you gain an ability for the next 1d4 sessions to sense the magical patterns in other magic users' minds. You can tell what spells they've memorized. Something backfires and something happens, or you accidentally call forth a devil, a demon, a hag, etc. So some flavor there for magical generation. Look at tombs, and it says a lot of dungeons were originally tombs, and it gives you some d6. Roll a table to describe something about a tomb that you might have discovered or be in. Sorcerer corpse hazards. You've killed the sorcerer, and what happens here? This is, I think it's a D12 table of various things that could happen after a magician dies. Again, pretty specific type of event in a session, but if that were the case in one of your sessions, you would have somewhere to go for that. Strange things happen when you sleep in dungeons. Sleeping in dungeons would not be great, so let's have it not be great in an interesting way. These are some different types of things that could possibly happen. This is a little hard to read. It's cool. The font is cool, but it's a little challenging to read. It's a D20 table of things that could happen to you if you were spending the night in a dungeon, or just even as just dungeon flavor walking into a dungeon. Some of these things could happen because that's a pretty dangerous thing. As a point is made here in this piece that we're always talking about managing light sources, but what would actually happen if you ran out of light in a dungeon? And there's a D12 table to suggest what that is. Here's a discussion of goblins and the types of spells that they might cast, and the writer says, I don't think that goblins should cast the same spell as people, because what kind of goblin knows sleep or magic missile? They don't. They're goblins. And there is a suggestion here of it looks like a D8 spells that they could possibly know. I searched the bookshelf. Good adventurers know that bodies aren't the only source of loot. Furniture is a good one too. And there is a D20 table here of things that you could find if you are searching a bookshelf. Back to an overview article of the anatomy of a dungeon map, and a discussion very nicely illustrated of the kinds of things, I would say architecturally speaking or logistically speaking, that could be in a map and what they might mean, including choke points and tricky bridges. And it's outlined here so you can see visually what the article is talking about, and giving some examples here, a case of 2 octagons, and talking about what this means and what, for example, a nexus point is. This is, if you watch my channel, enough, you know that I'm often talking about architecture and focusing on that. And I found this piece incredibly interesting. This concept of dungeon highways and how, if you're creating an elaborate map, there can or should be ways of getting through it quickly and why you would want that. And he's calling these accelerators, since clearing them allows fast enough travel through the dungeon. This piece in particular I found quite useful for just thinking about what it means to be in that type of space. Monster modifiers. If you want to spruce up your random monster encounters, roll a d20 on this table, and it will give you some backstory, in a sense, to your monsters. Really great piece of art here. So this is d20 background to monsters. The monsters are made of crystal. They mime the shape of a creature, but have smooth crystal skin and shimmer with the slightest bit of light. They don't breathe and appear as motionless statues until provoked. So you have the hit points. They're only harmed by bludgeoning weapons. That would make sense. Elemental attacks deal minimum damage. So this will add a little flavor onto your monster. Novel take on alignment here. It says the traditional alignment chart is usually among the first things one considers when rolling a new character. And he says the problem is, well, it's not very good. He says that a little more colloquially. And he comes up here with a new kind of alignment table that it's comprised of different opposing, I guess I would say, personality traits. You could be empathetic or callous, protective or manipulative, selfless or self-entitled. And then the hex square here is different combinations of those things. So if you're empathetic, protective, and selfless, you're up here. But if you're empathetic, manipulative, and selfless, you're here. And there is a discussion of each of the nodes that are in here and what that actually might mean. So you could have, with this alignment, the reluctant hero, a gritty, down-to-earth type who may appear gruff and cold, even rude on the outside, but who deep down truly cares for their friends. Or the spy master, an expert manipulator who can find and exploit people's strengths and weaknesses, conning with them emotionally only to use and abuse them. This is a very potentially useful thing, as either, if you're not actually doing alignment per se, but as backstory or contributing to the flavor or the feel of a character. And I can definitely see myself using this in the future. This is I would say, a thematic way of coming up with what gear might be by rolling on different words that will then be essentially prompts to come up with the functionality of something. So, for example, you say to generate random gear or chems, you roll the 2d20 to determine the first and second words of the name, and then you choose the combination of words that sound the most natural. And he says, the writer says, there's 3,200 possible results on all these 5 columns. And so you could have memory marbles, for example. Like, what would that actually be as gear? And you determine your game mechanics ad hoc based on what its name. And the name determines the functionality, as I said, and it gives some examples here of things that could be created through these lists. And I like this as well, particularly actually in combination with this, now that I think of it, because if you have a certain type of character that is, for example, empathetic, protective, and selfless, and they're carrying some memory marbles, those could be used in a benevolent way. Whereas if you had, and then you could build out the impact of those based on the character type. If you were dealing with someone who is sort of callous and manipulative or self-entitled, those memory marbles could be used in a different way, and then you would build that out in a different way, assuming, of course, people were carrying the type of gear that meshed with their personality, which didn't necessarily have to be the case. But this is, I really do think this is great, because prompts like this, written prompts like this to create something concrete, start you thinking along storylines. And this too is something I personally would find, I think, very useful. We have, it says, a village witch once told me that a thief was in truth a very, very specialized sorcerer. And there are discussions here about what um, the thief skills basically are, and building these out a little bit more narratively. All right, moving ahead a little more, there's a very valuable article here on In Praise of Vanilla Fantasy, essentially saying that vanilla fantasy can be useful because it can bring people into the hobby. And the writer says, if you want to explain what D&D is like to someone who has never had the pleasure of playing it before, it helps to have some established tropes and recognizable cultural references to fall back on. That can get you a lot farther with bringing someone into the hobby than talking about some type of crab person with magic and sticking patches of demon skin to your body. So if you're thinking about, as a DM, trying to bring new people into the hobby, that sticking to what we would call something vanilla is useful. Another article on goblins and lots of things: the utterly inexplicable goblin situation, the insane secret goblin warfare technique. These seem to be, well, these are D10. This looks like a D30 table. Lots of things to build out your goblin if that is something that you want to do. Some great suggestions here for adding more chaos to your battles, essentially using a poker deck of cards with some jacks that are originally taken out and then put back in, and when they are pulled, they then create some type of chaos events, so that you have activations that are not based on any type of particular initiative, but if you pull the card that you have assigned to one side of the battle or the other, and then as the rounds go, if you end up pulling a jack, you get a sudden type of chaos events, so that the last wounded combatant, is bleeding and continues to bleed out, or that battle rage happens and attacks automatically hit until the end of the round, something like that. I like this quite a bit, and it is something I think that could be modified. It is, from the illustrations and also the conceptually, it does seem as if it would work best if there were many combatants on either side, but I think it could be modified in some way I know it could be modified in some way to work pretty effectively with smaller numbers here. And I do like this concept, particularly the bringing in chaos events that may happen. This is a concept that credit is given here to Index Card RPG, and I recognize it from here, which is essentially assigning a set of HP to a task, and that slowly counting down the successes until you actually complete that task. And this, I think, for the soloist can be useful too, as opposed to just having say, a one difficulty number to overcome, the sense of progress and potentially things happening while you're trying to accomplish this task. Here are 5 tips for horror in D&D, and suggestions for creating this sense of terror or looming disaster that would be key to a successful horror session. A short piece, a D6 table on basically starting a session after something just happened. And I often try to do this and create this narratively when I do my play demos, but this is a really easy way to just roll a d6 and come up with that your party has just stolen something, or they have just been robbed, or something like that, to begin in some manner, as would be the case where everything that is happening has already been preceded by something else. Way to give an item a backstory, that if you find something, you can create aspects of it or an unfolding aspect of something that may give an indication of what it was used for beforehand, different characteristics that build upon each other to give some flavor to, in this case, it was a sword, but it could be even trinkets or something as well. And I've often talked about the value of using a physical item to create some foundation for a narrative development here. More articles about building dungeons and what is necessary to create a type of bounded fantastical space that is going to work for the needs of exploration and puzzling and player choices, the kinds of things that dungeon crawls excel at doing. And when the dungeons are built appropriately, it will enable a session to develop that. So we the I will say that I actually disagree with the perspective of Gus L. here, where Gus writes, "There's no story to a dungeon crawl. Narrative beats make assumptions about how the characters within this story will act and become difficult to maintain when you're in a dungeon." But he does say every location has a story and a history. So I do agree with that, but I'm not I wasn't quite sure. I read this piece a couple times trying to understand the purpose of saying there's no story to a dungeon crawl is, because it feels to me like the piece is actually saying that dungeons do enable story and based in the location of it. So that part was a little confusing to me, but nevertheless, there's a lot of advice in here about how to connect your theme and your story and to add in some ecology and factions, consider the locations of faction food and water sources, and linking all this to an active history of a dungeon. And I have many different videos on my channel that talk about the importance of doing that and ways to do that. This was a great piece I found on world building. When is enough too much? And it's really very explicitly directed at DMs who are doing prep before a session. But it talks about how you can spend a ton of time essentially for yourself creating all of this backstory that reader or players aren't necessarily interested in reading, and making the point that it's not as special as you think. Many world builders are kidding themselves about the uniqueness of the history they've written into their settings. And the writer says now is the only thing that matters. I think this is really a great point to highlight the ways in which, and of course it's not meant for this, but to me, this highlights the ways in which solo RPGing differs from, one of the ways in which it differs from regular RPGing. Because for the soloist, this type of work is part of the play and is always relevant because you are doing it for you as the GM as well as the player. And I think for traditional GMs who do this might think about the fact that maybe what they're doing is some solo RPG prep work for their session, and that if they do all of this and never bring it to the table explicitly with their players, or try to bring it to the table explicitly for their players who aren't interested, that it actually hasn't been wasted work. This is some inspirational spell shard tables. Says when you're coming up empty and you need an idea for a spell, sometimes a few word prompts help. And it's similar to what we saw earlier in this zine about generating some of those items or gear, a very kind of similar situation with rolling on these words and then giving some examples of some spells that might be prompted by that, and very easy to envision a story developing out of that. This is a piece on OSR GMing and the joy of letting go, and it also fits into this concept of why the OSR play style and rule sets that go with it are very conducive to solo RPGing. And as I said in my video on Knock number 1, I think that in and of itself could be the topic of a video that I might do in the future about the reasons why OSR rule sets and OSR, for lack of a better word, approach to RPGing is so conducive for the soloist and one of the things the writer here says is there's an unbelievable pleasure in being both creator and audience all at once. And of course, as a soloist, we are both of those things explicitly. Nice piece here on the bigger picture issues there. This is a section on what could happen if you read a cursed text with a roll, a D44, the first die determining the petty god the text concerns, and then the nature of the text. So it's coming up with some various curses that might happen when you read something that is a cursed text. What are those spiders doing? You rolled another giant spider on the encounter table, but you'd rather die than cheat on the encounter roll. Well, grab your trusty D30 and get ready to add some more denizens to your dungeon. So that gives a little flavor to the traditional type of, oh, it's a giant spider again. And ditto here, what is the gelatinous cube doing? I think these are by actually the same, yes, they are by the same person, different artist, but what are the gelatinous cubes doing? It's a D100 table. What is it that they're doing? It may have no, that's funny, it may have no direct impact on gameplay. So for example, they're wobbling after a mighty blow from a troll's club. Maybe that makes them easier to beat. I don't know. We saw this in the first edition of Knock, a sort of almost like fill in the blank. Here is complete the encounter, which the dungeon's master, the master is something who has claimed the dungeon, presented on the next spread here, and asking you then to complete the dungeon based on this diagram. A concise procedure developed for D6 hex crawling, providing activities to do like hunting and foraging, camping, exploring, an event table. I'm not sure that offers anything terribly new, but it, for people that want to do just a little bit of wilderness stuff, this would be, it's a very kind of very, very light way to do that. Another fool for your adventures. When a character dies, it's more important to get the player a replacement adventurer quickly than doing it in an entirely believable way. And these are some suggestions of low-level fighters, zero-level fighters, as in classless nobodies. And then if they can survive, they become a first-level class appropriate to their stats and description. And there's a D30 table of some random guys here with some semi-humorous description of who they, Mr. Moonlight, for example, blonde man, late 20s, black suit, sitting reading a chaos poetry paperback. He's so goth he wears sunglasses in bed. So you would need to choose these wisely to fit with the theme or the feel of what you're doing. A sibling snail, a humanoid snail looking at the party with strange eye stalks. And we move to a portfolio of cartographic curiosities. A little hard to read, but I like the design. This is, again, following the organization of Knock number 1, where we are going to be shown various pieces of art that are dungeons that have been drawn by around a variety of artists, and after this section that presents them, there is going to be a brief artist statement about the rationale behind it and perhaps the setting that it was in. This is part of the same thing. And again, as I said in the video on Knock number 1, the choice to display this as art, I think, is incredibly appropriate and accurate to something that's so important about OSR and just indie games in general, which is the level of creativity that is involved, the visual creativity, the artistic creativity, and the relationship of this to the gaming experience. And I've said in other videos with some materials I look at that I do wonder actually how around the table this works, because some of the pieces that are generated generally for the GM are so lush and so visually interesting that they would become part of the play experience. And I wonder, I've never done this, but I wonder, do the GM sort of pass the book around the table when they're looking at this beautiful thing? I don't know. Menagerie of Monstrosities we have here. These are keyed, as mentioned earlier, to old school essentials, but adaptable to many OSR rule sets. We have a flatterer who looks like a small bird of prey, similar to a Scops owl. In reality, it's a petulant fairy attracted to lawful and neutral characters, attempting to bewitch them. And as with this, we have all sorts of, we have great art and discussion of what they might be, what they might actually be doing. This blade warden has chromatic blade dust. When he's destroyed, their magical blade turns to a colored dust. This dust can be used for all kinds of interesting application. And I love this because it gives you something else to do after the combat. And if you dispense with this guy, then you actually get something else from it, and it continues on in the story. And I love that concept. We have a dream crawler here, and it is if a group of adventurers spends the night in the ruins of an ancient battlefield or under the burial mound of a famed fighter, there's a good chance they attract the attention of a dream crawler. They're warriors whose spirit could not find their way to Valhalla. Their hauntings, and they talk about what they might do. We have various types of demons here, and great art. Explanations of the various demonic things that they could do. Won't go into the detail there. This is a retinue of rogues. We have some PCs. I suppose you could, NPCs or PCs, either way, I suppose they could be. The Errant Friar, again, keyed to OSE, but you could use this as you wished. A bad brownie. Bad brownies can use all types of weapons appropriate to their statures. They are someone who was banished from the Sealy court after doing something particularly odious. The Gray, this is a really cute little, kind of like a lost ET guy, who is a limp gray-skinned creature from outer space who has lost contact with the mothership. He's stranded and he is searching. Peaceful Giant, not sure how to pronounce that. It's Peaceful Giant with a strong connection to the wilds they love so much. So almost like a druidic type of giant, and they have magic of the stones. They've learned to tap into giant kinds linked to the wilds and elemental earth. Once per day, they can ask for a favor, effectively casting a cleric spell of their choice. Interesting concept. I like playing giants. When I look back at some of the characters I've saved, when the giant is an option, I tend to go for that. An excursion here, a section of excursions, extraordinary excursions. These are essentially scenarios that you could play. And this one is an old sewer radio pasteurization point crawl dungeon. It uses silver where others use gold, and it looks to be, as you can see here, focused on this concept of the metal. We have a wilderness hex crawl here, a war-torn hex crawl for low-level adventurers, and we have a dungeon module for levels 1 to 3. This is somewhere under the sewers. We have this, and this layout is pretty detailed. We have the overall structure here. There's cultists and fly swarms and giant rats, and then it's built out to show you the section of the map with exactly what it is. Storage, there's a grinning statue, a treasury, a rat room, and then the Rot King looks to be the boss of this dungeon. And we finish it out with some art. I don't know whether I showed you this flyleaf at the outset. I don't think I did. This is also a hex crawl situation here, a map of Gloomy Wood that you could use. And it is, again, it's just a lot of prompts. So, for example, the Scold's Cage, where once the statue of a knight stood, a great domed iron cage now rises with chains, large enough to fit 6 or 8, and kindling if needed. Yet the statue shall speak to those who come close and betray a strange secret. So you could really take something here and just use that as the start of an adventure that either stayed outside in this particular wilderness or went inside somewhere else. And you can just see the ton of content here. And this came with a postcard that I want to show you for sure. It has two-sided adventurers here you could cut out as standees with some stats for who they might be. There's a thief, a magic user, a cleric, a dwarf, and they have a little bit of specificity in terms of what they can do. So this magic user he's a demon's child with bat wings under his cape, and he must drink human blood before memorizing spells. So just content upon content here in knock number 2, as in knock number 1. I, along with probably many people, eagerly await knock number 3. I don't have any sense of when that will be, but if I can, I will certainly bring that to the channel, and I'm sure you'll be seeing both knock number 2 and knock number 1 in future videos, because as I mentioned, as during the page through, some of these things really spoke to me and could see using them to great effect in future videos.